So let's all rise and shine, yes? The second set of scripture readings continue with the story of Noah found in Genesis, and we've got two different chapters that we're looking at. So chapters 8 and 9, a series of verses. If you want to read along in the Pew Bibles, again, slightly different translation, but you can find it on pages 6 and 7 if you are so inclined. That's small print I'm going to use up here. I've got a set of Bibles I brought with me. They're 4 volumes. Giant print. I could have someone hold it about halfway back and see it. It's fantastic. At the end of 40 days, Noah opened the window of the ark that he had made and sent out the raven. And it went to and from until the waters were dried up from the earth. Then he sent out the dove from him to see if the waters had subsided from the face of the ground. But the dove found no place to set its foot, and it returned to him to the ark. For the waters were still on the face of the whole earth. So he put out his hand and took it and brought it into the ark with him. He waited another 7 days. And again he sent out the dove from the ark. And the dove came back to him in the evening, and there in its beak was a freshly plucked olive leaf. So Noah knew that the waters had subsided from the earth. Then he waited another 7 days and sent out the dove, and it did not return to him anymore. Then God said to Noah and his sons with him, "As for me, I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, and every animal of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. I established my covenant with you that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood. And never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth." God said, "This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth." God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth." May God's blessing rest upon the experiences of Scripture on this day, upon the meditations of our hearts, the songs that we sing, and the words of my lips. People have been thinking about high waters for a very long time. As was mentioned before, it's becoming a little more front and center again for us as we are keeping an eye on things east of here and thinking of the people in the islands between Florence and us. But people have been thinking about high water for a very long time. There are tales of flood as destruction and renewal that dot humanity throughout our history in almost every single culture and geographic location around the earth. We have some sort of ancient flood story. In the ancient Eastern Mediterranean world, we have these tales of floods as well, and if we are familiar with some of the other ones, we might have seen a few signs in the scripture today. In these wide variety of stories that come from the same place where the people Israel resided, we find deities great and small causing waters to rise for some reason or another. Sometimes these deities cause a flood because they're just petty. They're having a temper tantrum, and so they cause a flood. Sometimes these deities cause a flood because, imagine this, people were just too noisy. They got upset. Those humans, they just, all the time with their rock and roll. Sometimes the deities would cause a flood because they decided that the first run at creation they had wasn't working out. We have story of at least one deity who created immortals and giants and realized that it just wasn't working out well. And so they caused a flood to wipe the earth clean. Perhaps we find ourselves in a story where a flood exists because people who were given the freedom to think and choose chose shiny things, destructive things. Perhaps, like in the movie reference, they chose the gem-encrusted goblet and not the one that actually held the waters of life. And in taking more than we need and hoarding it for ourselves, these people sinned. Perhaps. All of these stories, these flood stories from the Eastern Mediterranean world, have common themes and motifs. They're intertwined. There's a good crash course on world mythology. It's about a 15-minute video that actually compares many of these stories. And if you're interested in looking at some of the other ones from around the world, it's 2 other videos, about 45 minutes in total. In that crash course, which is designed for AP history students, we find our particular story lifted up as well. Now, we could emphasize the boat, and there's lots of images of the boat. There's recreations of the boat. There's even there's a PBS special where they got reeds and they got some tar and they built sort of a spherical, almost a semicircular boat in what they think was an ancient tradition, and it sort of floated. Had a few leaks, but it happens. But it's not the boat that we're really interested in. And we find that in these different stories, the boat changes, and whether or not there is a boat. There's even one where there's no boat at all. The flood comes and the god tells the person to gather the animals and go to a mountain fortress. Reminds me of the movie Waterworld almost. I'm sorry if you've seen it. But it's not the number of days, it's not the boat, because there's some of these number of days, 7 days, 40 days, whatever. It's not even the type of bird. We noticed in this one there was 2 different birds that were thrown out. There was a raven and a dove in our interpretation of the story that takes place. And in the various stories of floods in the Eastern Mediterranean, it could be a raven, it could be a dove, it could be something else. And so the type of bird, we can do something with it, but that's not really where I think we're focusing here as we start this new worship series on lifelines. No, it's something else that actually makes the difference between these flood stories. And it's the same thing that makes a difference in the various creation stories that come out of the Eastern Mediterranean world. I mean, yes, the boat and the bird and the olive branch, all of these things have become part of our language, our lexicon, even our liturgy. We use doves and olive branches and things along those lines. But I think in this particular case, the teller of the Noah story wanted us to continue to build a relationship with God, to better understand God, the nature of God, and what that relationship is like. And the teller of this story, the one who records it for us in its final setting that's handed down, is understood to be the same author or authors who give us the second creation story, the Garden of Eden. The same ones who give us the Cain and Abel story. and the same ones who give us the Babylon Tower story. All three of those stories center on creation, people, the earth, and issues of sin. We are to understand that the people that God created and tasked with the tilling of the earth had wandered off, chasing shiny things, trying to grasp more than was theirs or that they needed. And God repented of the freedom of choice that the people received. So the story goes, God, like so many other deities in the Eastern Mediterranean basin, brings a flood. And perhaps this is some sort of long cultural memory of a flood that created the Black Sea. It's been theorized. Who knows? The story's told and it's Scripture, and we understand it's Scripture, and we know that Scripture has been handed down to us centuries since its final writing, and it's in our laps now or on the screen at some point. And what does it tell us about God? What is it revealing about God in this flood story? Because the deities in other flood stories really don't come off in a good light. Most of them don't. There might be one or two that do okay. I mean, we could point to the anger of God if we wanted to. That, seems to be revealed. We could point to Noah's obedience. That's a faith in God. That's something important. We can point to the animals that God created. We could even point to the fact that until the flood was over, we weren't allowed to eat the animals. Imagine that. Bringing something tasty on the ark. But if we were to literally take the Scripture at its word, it was not eaten by people until the flood had come and gone. We were vegetarians, just like pandas, pointy teeth and rabbit food all day long. So what makes this flood a different sort of story? Promises, specifically God's promises. Covenant is the language that's used, and we think of covenant as a contractual agreement, right? We enter into covenant agreements. We have to sign them. I have covenants that I have ended up sort of, putting my name upon. There's some in the office or all over the place. We do these contracts between two or more parties, these commitments, these guarantees, these pledges. We enter into all of these sorts of things. We have covenant agreements of mutual support, of mutual aid, mutual trust, etc., so on and so forth. In fact, our movement, the Christian Church Disciples, is built upon covenant understandings. We are, historically and by design, a covenantally bonded group of congregations, local, regional, and general. That's what binds us together. There's no authority outside of the congregation that says we have to be disciples. We enter into covenant. And we understand that those covenant bonds that we enter into can and at times are broken. Churches leave the movement, partnerships dissolve, allies do not always come to the aid of each other. In this flood story, a story that has been scooped up and made part of the baptismal immersion history, a story that's part of our faith and tradition, a story that's part of secular culture. We've made movies about it. I would have liked to have seen one done by Mr. DeMille. I am ready for my close-up. There's a covenant, there's a promise, there's a contract in this story, an agreement, a pledge. And that is where this story sets itself off from all the other flood stories. God makes a promise. That's why this story becomes important to us in the scriptural setting. And the promise is to creation, to humans. But it's not a covenant in a traditional sense of the word. Again, we often think of a covenant as being between two or more parties, and we bring something to the table, right? We enter into an agreement, we agree in, say, marriages, and we share property or something along those lines, or whatever it may be, whatever covenantal arrangement we enter into. This covenant, with its symbol, all covenants in Scripture have a symbol, a sign that points to something larger than itself. This covenant, we don't bring anything to the table at all. We offer nothing. We don't bring any goods. We don't bring any services. We don't even offer to worship the living God. The promise is utterly one-sided. God and God alone is capable of making this promise, this covenant. And these one-sided covenants like this, we find them in other places. There was one that was made to Abraham. You might remember the story. He has to gather the animals and cut them and split them, and then he goes into a dreamlike state, and he sees a torch go down the middle. God is making a promise to Abraham, a covenant. Abraham brings nothing. He sets the animals out, but that's not the covenant itself. He brings nothing. It's totally one-sided. It's just God reaching out, seeking, throwing a lifeline to drag people in. It's actually a lot like the covenant that we partake in every Sunday. We gather to worship, but the act of worshiping God is not us bringing something to the table. I mean, what do we do? What do we bring to the communion feast? We are invited no matter what, and we show up and are given a gift. It's a one-sided gift. And it's cast out into our becalmed or tempest-tossed lives that we might be reeled in to be closer to God. And if God is indeed God, and I don't think we would be here if we didn't believe that, and if we've grasped the line of thought, then the covenant that God enters into, these one-sided covenants, will not be broken. No other flood story offers that. None from the Eastern Mediterranean world, from the ancient Eastern Mediterranean world, brings us a God who reaches out to humans in that way. The God of Israel is revealed as something that is ultimately different from the objects of worship that surround the people. God is different from the objects of worship even today. In the midst of a flood, literal, metaphorical, whatever, we find a lifeline tossed out, a covenant promise, a sign and a symbol that God is watching out and desires for us to be connected. Thanks be to God. Amen.